I'm Julia. I'm a marketer by day and a literature enthusiast by night. Um, and I am very, very pleased to be joined by Nathan Oates and to be talking about the brand new book in Armada, A Flaw in the Design, which has been just translated into Romanian. Um, I loved it since I saw the cover. And ever since I sort of heard about the book, I admit I read it in both English and Romanian, just so I could get all the details and understand everything. I also did English literature in undergrad, so that's where my like fast reading comes from. Um, and I'm gonna start so I can talk less. Flaw in the Design is a psychological thriller. Is there anything in particular that sort of drew you to the genre? Are there any thriller or like crime novels that maybe inspired this, or how did you end up with this book?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here and to have an honor to have my book published by such a great house in Romania and to have it translated into Romanian. The amount of like work and attention that goes into a book in translation is just astonishing to me, and I'm eternally grateful and think of translators as, the real heroes of literature. So grateful to be here, and it's very exciting to be talking to your readers. And I love the cover as well. I think it's great. I love the way the letters are shaded. I love the use of the house. It's a little
Yeah.
similar to the British paperback is a little bit like that. I don't know if you've seen that one, but it also
Yes.
uses the house.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been very fun to also see the different covers and permutations as it's changed. But to get to your question, uh, all my writing comes out like largely, I think, out of reading. Um,
Mm.
which is I am a professor as well, and I tell my students all the time, you have to read all the time if you want to be a writer, and I just always have since I was a kid. And one of the most important writers for me was Stephen King, who I know is also published by
Yeah.
in Romania. And I just, when I was a teenager, sort of like coming into my own sort of reading on my own all the time, it was Stephen King that just sort of consumed me, and I read all his books. My parents were literature professors, and so they were a little disconcerted that I was so focused. But I think it sort of helped me understand this idea of suspense, but also sort of these. Stephen King is a very interesting writer to me because he's sort of on the borderline between like a very clearly genre
Mm.
oriented narrative and a literary narrative. And I liked the way back then, which I think has become more widely acknowledged now, he blurred those boundaries
Hmm.
between the literary and the genre. And I loved him. And then my sort of transition writer into sort of what we call in America literary fiction
Hmm.
was Flannery O'Connor,
Yeah.
who now in retrospect really seems like an obvious transition point because her books are filled with violence and suspense and sort of thriller elements as well. So those were sort of my two foundational writers. And with the writing of this book, though, because it is a psychological thriller, and I've written sort of short stories and
Mhm.
other works as well, but this was very clearly influenced by a couple books. Maybe the most obvious one is Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley, and the whole Ripley series, although I
Yeah.
really think the first one is by far the best. The others are fun. The second one is also really good and set in France. I loved that book. I think it again, like Stephen King, is sort of on this borderline and sort of navigates
Mhm.
back and forth across genre expectations in a way that I think is really fun, and it's really quick and speedy. And that was something also that sort of I was thinking of while writing the novel is like, what's the most fun thing to have happen next? And I was always trying to remind myself to like keep it pushing it forward, but also make it fun. As Patricia Highsmith does a great job of, this dread builds in
Mhm.
Highsmith novels, and yet it's still really fun, even as like this, and you're rooting for this horrible person. um, and then another novel that's less of a crime or thriller, and I think more probably of a traditional literary novel, although I do think it is in some ways a thriller, is Doris Lessing's The Fifth Child. I don't know if you've ever read that novel, but Doris Lessing is just a wonderful novelist. I think she won the Nobel Prize. She's a great writer. And The Fifth Child is this very short book of hers about a family who have four children, live outside London, have these very sort of vibrant, happy lives, and they decided to have a big family. They have a fifth child, and that child is very, very bad.
Okay, I see.
And so it's about sort of bad children, but also about families and the way families can get poisoned, and like happiness can sort of turn from the inside into something much darker. And that novel I just find incredibly propulsive and thrilling and terrifying, really, in a way, even though it is not maybe conventionally a crime novel. And then a writer that I thought about a lot while writing A Flaw in the Design was Vladimir Nabokov. He who is, Lolita and Pale Fire and Despair. And a lot of these novels are very arch high literary novels, but they're also crime novels. Yeah. They're also about murders. There's almost always a murder. Not in all of his novels, but in many of his books, there's a murder sort of at the heart of the book that propels this telling. And he's very interested in unreliable narration and the sort of also the integration of different types of text, which I thought was really fun. Pale Fire is obviously a much more complex and experimental novel than A Flaw in the Design, but I was very much inspired by this interplay between reality and fiction in the narrative. And so I really love that element of Nabokov, who's great to read on the sentence level, but then also great to read for plot in a lot of unexpected ways, I think. So those were some of the major works that sort of influenced this book. And then I can also talk about like stuff that comes out of my life, which was having children. So I had kids years ago now. My daughter is a teenager now, but the having children is a really interesting experience for the writer, I think, because you're suddenly exposed to a much wider group of people than you would have been before, where you're able to select, right? You're an adult and you're choosing your friends and where you go. And all of a sudden you're thrust into this more common space of like school and playgrounds. And and I was fascinated when my kids were little by the way in which a lot of children, although not all, are often really bad. But usually bad for short periods of time, or they're trying out sort of badness and like how much can they get away with. And then almost all of them, in America, we have this term, the terrible twos, meaning like when the child is 2 years old, they're often very willful and resistant.
Okay.
Terrible. And and so I was interested in the way that like in that experience, but then also like, what if a child, that was just their nature? What if they didn't change and sort of evolve and become more socialized, or did become more socialized, but still at their core had this badness as like the center of their being, and how frightening that would be for everybody around them. And so then that was also sort of part of the seed of this book.
What I loved about your answer is that you just touched upon all the things that I have, like all the questions that are gonna be like I have written down. But also all the like books you have mentioned that I have read. Most of them, I remember at the end feeling like I just had a fever dream because they were so like gripping and there was so much happening. And then I just kept reading. So at the end, when I sort of emerged from the story, I was like, what has happened? And to be honest, it did like A Flaw in the Design did kind of feel like that. I am now at a point in life where I can sort of like pull myself away. Except that with this book, I was like, there's this feeling that I really love about it, where you sort of are aware, even when you begin the book, that like something bad is going on or is going to go on, or like, you're anticipating something happening. So there's always like this dread. Like as you turn the page, like, And then like when characters appeared, I kept being like, okay, sort of like, who are you? What's gonna happen? And because I did read a bit about it beforehand, I was like, are you like really like this? Is this really? And then, as we progressed, and we had Jill who kept also being very suspicious. I was like, okay, we're sort of blending in with the narrator. So uh, because of this, I feel like some of the themes, because of it's not everything, are sort of to do with like deception and with trust and like this hidden darkness. And I know you did sort of touch upon this, of like what inspired you to write it. But is there anything sort of beyond the having children that grow up to be bad, and like never leave that behind, and all these like books? Mostly, I'm curious how the characters came to be, because they're so like I feel like the story is very sort of character driven, as well as obviously the plot. Um, but you have, the family and the dynamic, so they influence a lot of the experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to talk a little bit about like where that all comes from. I mean, Gil is the main character, who is a writer and a professor. I'm a
Mhm.
writer and a professor. He lives in Vermont, where I do not live. I live in New York City, but have spent a lot of time in Vermont. I lived in Vermont
Mhm.
when I was a child. And in some ways, I think in a lot of my books, when I write the sort of main character, he's sort of a version of myself, but not myself, sort of like an alternate self
Mm.
that I could have been. Um, and so there's a lot of me and Gil, but Gil is much more problematic, I hope, than I am. He's much more frustrated. He's much more, I think, in an interesting way, sort of unhappy, because in some ways he's very happy in his life
Mm.
until the book starts, basically.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
he has a nice wife, he has two children that he loves, he lives in a nice place. He may not
That's
have
what it
as
will
much money
start.
as he,
Yeah.
yeah, wants, but he has a job. And like, Vermont is a really beautiful part of the United States. It's
Mm.
mountainous and gorgeous, and Burlington is a beautiful city. Um, so he has a good life. And one of the things I always thought about, like, for Gil, I mean, at the seed of the story, I had this idea, like, when you have children, you have to think about what happens if in an what happens if you die, right? Where do they go? Who takes care of them? And
Hmm.
when you're having children, often people and family members are having the same sort of discussions about like what would happen in the worst case scenario.
Hmm.
What if the unimaginable happened? What would happen? Where would your children go? Um, and so I was thinking about that a little bit, and I was like, what would happen if you had a really bad child and he had to go live with family? And then I thought, okay, I'll create the family that would be in some ways, or the father, the main character, would be most resistant to that.
Hmm.
And then,
Hmm.
like, why is he so resistant? And that sort of produces all of the backstory, his
Hmm.
own sort of psychological problems, his own anxieties, his own sort of self-loathing that he has about himself and his writing career, his jealousy, his enormous jealousy of his sister, who was extremely wealthy. Her husband is like, a hedge fund manager, uh, and so is they have millions and millions of dollars and lavish apartments and country homes, and his jealousy of that and frustration in his own life, and sort of trying to find constantly the ways to like amp everything up as much as possible without tipping over into melodrama, but getting
Hmm.
like right up to the edge of of
Hmm.
melodrama in a way. So it comes out of this sort of stress also that children put on families, which I think is really interesting. I have brothers, and when you have the next generation arrive, suddenly those older relationships with your siblings change, not necessarily bad, as did happen in this novel for the characters, but they do change substantially because suddenly there's this new dynamic that's come in and it's altered, and the children are their own selves, right? My children and my brother's kids are all lovely children. But what if they weren't, right? What if one of them was like really awful, and yet they're your blood and they're your family, and you have an enormous responsibility to them, and yet you also, like, as is the case in this novel, Gil just really does not like his nephew. In fact, I think it's fair to say he hates him and thinks of him as an evil person, and yet he comes to live in Gil's home, and that sort of is like in some ways Gil's worst nightmare. Which is because Matthew brings with him all the anxieties that Gil is so afraid, his own sort of sense of his own inability to be the person he wants to be. And Matthew has endless resources. Matthew is very handsome, very intelligent, very charismatic, very talented, and has all these things seemingly without any effort. And Gil is so jealous of him in a really sort of, I hope, understandable, but also really problematic way. It's not, and so it started with Gil, really, and that character and that figure, which was drawn certainly in part out of myself, and then just trying to constantly complicate Gil's situation.
I think because I did see that there's like people already who have very mixed feelings about Gil and the characters themselves, but I sort of like, I can understand why you would be so like, oh, he's horrible, or like, oh my God, the way everything plays out. But I think he is sort of horrible to watch as a reader because of all this that's happening in his head. Like, I do think if we sort of saw outside of him, would be more like, man, okay. But I think it adds a great like layer to the story that wouldn't otherwise exist without him. Background and real inspiration drawn from your life and put into him. I can only imagine there must have been like bits of the story that were more difficult to write than others. Is that the case? Were there any bits that were like just hard to get through?
Yeah, so that's a good question and interesting, because I wrote the book really quickly. As quickly as possible. So I'm a professor, so usually I'm teaching a lot of classes and like trying to fit my writing in. But the year I wrote A Flaw in the Design, we were living in Florence, Italy, and I had taken a year off of teaching because my wife gotten a position teaching in Florence. And so we were living in Florence, and I was like in charge of groceries and getting the kids to school and learning enough Italian to navigate Stora.
And difficult.
But otherwise, I had writing time, like much more writing time than I'd had in like decades, really, in a way. And so I was like, I'm going to write a novel, again, to return to Stephen King. In his book On Writing, he talks about how the way to write a novel is to write 2,000 words a day, every day. And I'd never just had the time to do that. And I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to write 2,000 words a day. And I started, and I sort of got swept into the sort of fever dream. So that, I hope I like that description of the experience of reading. I really love books that create this sort of propulsive fever dream quality. I hope this book will do that for some readers, or for all readers even. And it happened to me while writing it. And so a lot of it happened really quickly. And when I think back about like, what were the difficult times, I know there were hard parts to write, but I was so dedicated to the 2,000 to 3,000 words every day, no matter what, that I just sort of poured myself past it. And that was really freeing as a writer. It meant a lot of revision. I had to revise and do, dozens of drafts of the novel, because it was, there were parts of it that were messy. And there was a lot more backstory in the first part, and cutting that out, that was hard, because I like backstory. Fun to write. It provides a sort of tonal shift in the novel that sort of frees you, especially when you're immersed in it in the writing. Um, but there was too much, and I needed to keep the story moving forward and keep cutting out back sections. That was difficult. But the book did come really quickly. Like, it just sort of flowed out quickly. The revision process was complicated, sort of figuring out, because Gil is a very unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
And he was probably not unreliable enough in the first draft.
Oh.
It was more obvious that Gil was correct in all of his sort of assessments.
Okay.
And it didn't make sense that other people didn't believe him because the evidence seemed so obvious. So I had to find ways to constantly sort of darken the world around Gil so that it becomes more shadowy and sort of foggier, so that it's not so clear. And Gil is doing more of, he's forcing this version of the truth that he wants to be true. You know, he doesn't want it to be true, of course, in some ways, but in other ways he does. Right?
Yeah.
He wants to be correct about who Matthew is. And so the book came like really easily. The revision process was complicated. I worked on it with my great agent. She was really good and helped me like revise it pretty extensively. And then with my editor as well, who was, you know, would give these very gentle, my American editor would give these very gentle suggestions that would lead to these major changes. Somehow it's like, I don't know how she planted the idea in my head, but it would then evolve and change. And so most of the work for me, what felt like work and difficulty came in. So.
I mean, you did listen to Stephen King in the end, because he's also the one who's like, write and then just cut down. So I would say like a tightly woven plot, in the sense that like it keeps going and sort of unraveling. And there are all these, like, I would call them twists, because I've experienced them as such in my fever dream of of reading the book. Do you? I mean, you did say that everything sort of came out, and you did write it all quickly. Did you plan it out first, or did like it all just sort of come to you as you were writing, and you discovered all these like twists and the way like the plot sort of was tightly woven as you worked on it?
So I don't plan at all. Maybe I have too much of the Flannery O'Connor like voice in my head. She says in one of her essays that she doesn't plan anything because she likes to be surprised by her character. And I like that too. So I don't plan it out. I mean, one of the things I do, which is not planning, but is this sort of unconscious planning, I suppose, that like I'll get an idea for something. I'm like, oh, that would be a good novel. But then I let it sit in my head. I like don't let myself. Sometimes I'll write the very beginning, but then I'll be like, no, I got to stop, because it's got to sort of seep into the imagination, and you have to sort of dream about it and think about it, and in a way, but also I just have it there in the mind, sort of evolving, sort of gathering things to it. So that then when you do sit down to write it, it's sort of formed, but unknown to me. That sounds kind of mystical, I guess, but I don't like outline the book. I don't, but I have a vague sense of the plot, right? I knew like, but I liked to have certain turns. So Gil makes a lot of bad decisions in this book. And each time he did it, I think like some readers, I was like, don't do that. That's just a bad idea, but I couldn't stop him. And there he went to go spy on his nephew while his nephew was over at a girl's house in Burlington, making bad choices.
That was, I was very like,
escalating series of sources. And George Saunders, who's a really wonderful American short story writer and novelist, talks. I saw him actually when I was in Florence writing this book. He would come for a literary festival in Florence, along with Margaret Atwood and a bunch of other great writers. And he was talking about this principle that he teaches his students, which is that every time something happens, like stories work through repetition and accretion and sort of accumulation and expansion. And so a thing would happen, then it would sort of happen again, right? But it has to be like more so. Like you can have things repeating, people can keep making sort of bad decisions, but each time they do, it needs to get worse, right? Or more extreme, more dramatic, so that the story is constantly pushing forward, and not sort of milling and grinding in the same way. So I had that sort of in my head because I was writing it when I heard him say that. And so every time Gil would do something, I was like, this needs to be worse than the thing before. It needs to be like it and within the context, but also just expanding. And so that's not planning, that's not outlining, but it is the sort of vague sense of like storytelling guidance that the story has to always be surging forward in significant ways in order to keep being interesting to the reader. And that was fun to have Gil just make bad decision after bad decision.
And stress me out
yeah.
constantly.
And me too. I was like, it seems clear that he's making terrible choices. Pretty like about at least from halfway on. And yet to him, they seem more and more obviously the correct choice, or in some ways the only choice that he could make. And so finding that balance was a lot of fun. But I do like to be surprised and have stories sort of evolve. I'm working on a new novel now, and I'm in that process of like, I thought certain characters were one way, and then it turns out they're much more complicated than I had originally planned. And the way that changes the whole sort of structure of the book is very enjoyable. So I like that element of writing.
Well, first of all, I'm looking forward to whatever comes next. You mentioned balance, so I'm going to ask about another balance that sort of I feel is tough to get in thriller novels because they rely on this unknown. What I talked about, the sort of sense that like something bad's happening, what's happening, and this how did you find sort of working out the balance between divulging enough information and sort of leading the reader down the breadcrumb trail that is the truth, I guess, whatever that is, versus keeping it hidden and not giving away too much. I mean, you did say that initially in the first draft, Gil was just too right about everything. So
yeah, it was basically, I mean, one of the interesting parts of it, as I said, so I mean, the main characters, for those who haven't read the book, which I assume will be lots of people like who might see this, there's Gil, who we've been talking about as the main character, and his nephew Matthew, who is Gil is maybe the protagonist, sort of the hero of the book, and Matthew is maybe the villain of the book, or it's reversed, although it's hard for me to think of Matthew as a hero, but he may not be a villain in the way that Gil thinks he is. And that was, so the story is told through Gil, and so he sees Matthew in this very blinkered way, this very limited way of like, he's bad, he was a bad little boy, he's must still be bad now, he hasn't changed, he is evil essentially, and he's trying to sort of prove to himself that he's right, and that he has, and this is because he's sort of afraid and jealous of Matthew, as I've talked about, but also because his whole relationship with his sister, who has died, that happens in the first chapter as mentioned, so I feel like that's not too much of a spoiler, is he feels enormous guilt about that relationship, right? Because he sort of cut off his relationship with his sister because of Matthew and an event that happens in the book in the past. And so he wants it to be true. He needs it to be true. And one of the parts that was fun for me writing the book was the way Matthew would evolve, because you only see him through Gil, but he, and so in the beginning, he was very sort of simple. But then as I revised, developed scenes, expanded his dialogue, he became more and more interesting to me. I mean, I don't think Matthew's the kind of person I would want to be friends with, but it doesn't mean he's as bad as Gil thinks he is. And so there's this sort of balance that was, or imbalance in the narrative between like who he, and other people see Matthew really differently. Right? I mean, a lot of people in the book like him. Gil's own wife seems to like him. Gil's children seem to like him. Gil's other students at the university where Matthew enrolls in Gil's creative writing class. They all seem to like him. And so Gil is sort of the only one. And so it was this creation of the character of Matthew and giving him space on the page to like become more real and to become more of a human, was constantly problematizing Gil's own very blinkered perception that he has of who his nephew is. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it was the
there's no right or wrong answer to this. And we've kept sort of talking about unreliable narrators. And I do think that there's sort of a fascination about unreliable narrators, mainly because they kind of force the reader to be, to play detective and figure out the truth themselves. And I also feel like there's a fascination, especially with the whole true crime obsession that's become a very big thing, of people who sort of prove to be different to how they initially seemed. Do you have any thoughts and theories about why sort of unreliable narrators and this sort of people who aren't as they like seem to be, sort of captivate us so much? Because we've also talked about other literature that includes these kind of characters.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know why everyone is fascinated by it, but I am of the camp that all narrators are unreliable. I don't really think there's such a thing as a reliable narrator, even a sort of third person omniscient narrator. I'm just like, maybe it's sort of my study of postmodern and post-structuralist theory, but the idea that there is some sort of Archimedean point of objectivity that you can stand on and like adjudicate the world seems to me like not true, or at least exceedingly rare. And so I think all narrators are to greater and lesser degrees sort of unreliable. And I think there's a lot of, I think in some ways we all know this. I think we all go through our days and of course you can't know exactly how other people's minds work, but talking to people and not quite saying what you mean to say. You have like an idea of like, oh, I'm going to talk about this. And then you talk and you hear yourself and it's something a little different. And then you respond. And so like what you really mean and who you like, what you're really trying to express is almost often inexpressible. And this is very true in the writing of novels, right? Novels are almost always better in your mind than on the page. There's this sort of ideal form of it that exists somewhere in a sort of magical ether that is almost impossible to transmute through language into the page, because it's sort of a pre-linguistic story in mind. And so that translation of like our thoughts into our spoken words, our ideas into our written words, is there's always things that fall away, little bits that get lost, bits of meaning, bits of self. And so I'm very fascinated by that sort of fragmentation that inevitably occurs. And so I mean, unreliable narrators are my favorite kind of narrators. And they're always the more extreme they are in some ways, the more I like Nabokov's. I mean, Humbert is, just an utterly evil man in a lot of ways, and yet completely compelling as a narrator in a way that is extremely uncomfortable. And so I'm interested in those sorts of extremes. I do think the people who appear to be sort of normal but are not normal is also that you mentioned that as well. The sort of like, I guess I would say our sort of obsession, and use this word in the email, sort of psychopaths. I think that's sort of a thing that people are very interested in because they're monsters to one extent, right? They seem unhuman or inhuman. And in another way, because they're this almost pure expression, at least of a kind of Western capitalist aesthetic, right? They're just utterly selfish in a way that is like monstrous and not workable in a social sense, but also in some ways, at least, you know, in the United States, I can talk about it like you're sort of pushed toward that, right? It's like be selfish, build your own wealth, amass it as no matter at any cost. And that, you know, nobody's saying go out and kill people, but this idea that like you focus on yourself, you focus on your individual acts, and for artists as well, right? That it's all, there's this kind of narcissism in the culture that then psychopaths are, they just fully inhabit that. They have no qualms, no guilt, no controls. They're just utterly selfish creatures that pursue their own pleasure in whatever horrible, usually, form that manifests. And so they're very, I think there's something like terrifying because they're this pure expression of a kind of capitalist logic, and then also fascinating and alluring for the same reason, in a way that I think is, and Matthew, who is either a psychopath or not,
Yeah.
it's certainly debatable, is like, to Gil stands for that, right? He's like, he's ultra,
exactly.
he's powerful, you know, he's a young man, but he has enormous resources. He's extraordinarily good looking and powerful in that way. He's young and strong. He seems to have all of the access to power in a way. And it's the psychopath's sort of pure expression of that power that makes them sort of compelling, I think, in a way.
Yeah.
Not that we want to be psychopaths, but there's this part of the mind that is sort of being pulled toward that all the time, at least in American culture. I'm not sure Romanian.
I mean, it's I don't think it's as prevalent here, but the whole sort of true crime, and all the podcasts and all the documentaries have reached us here, so it's growing. But I do think it's also like the fascination is because it's obviously not okay, like in society, but then to inhabit that just fully, it's like, whoa, okay. Impressive. um so again, you have mentioned that you do teach writing, and that you have done so for a number of years. How do you feel sort of that teaching and having all that sort of knowledge has shaped and influenced you as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, a lot in the United States. I'm not sure what the situation is in Romania. Most writers, or many writers anyway, teach because of the economics of being a writer. But
Yeah.
it's an interesting, I mean, I've been doing it for a very long time, so it seems like just sort of natural to me. And most of the writers I know also teach, but it draws on the same energy as writing, right? Because you're thinking about language, you're thinking about story, you're responding to other people's stories, you're reading stories for craft and thinking about them and then discussing them with people. And so in some ways it is in conflict with writing, right? In a way that might be larger than many other sort of types of work. The great benefit of teaching is the freedom of time that it provides. Like you're much less constrained in terms of like where you need to be when. Yeah, I teach 2 days a week, so I have 3 days of the work week where I'm not on campus teaching. And so that gives me more time to work on writing, which is part of the university structure, encourages that. And so it both like feeds the writing and pulls away from the writing. And that was something I tried to work into the book as well. Gil is a creative writing professor, and he feels stymied in his writing career. And I'm not sure he blames it on his teaching, but I think a part of him does. I think a part of him is like, if I wasn't teaching all the time, I would be writing. And so I think there's this tension that exists for most people who do it. Probably if you have any other kind of work and you're a writer, you feel a similar sort of tension, but it's especially weird when you're teaching because it's the same, you're talking about the same thing that you're doing in your creative life. You're talking about language and you're talking about stories. There are lots of, that said, Gil has a kind of negative attitude. I have a much more positive attitude, I think. One of the interesting things when you teach is that you keep returning to the same texts all the time because you know how to teach them, but also you find them useful for students and they're illuminating to them and helpful. And so there are certain short stories that I've read 30, 40 times now, which is not normal to read a story that many times. Most readers will read a book and then be done and very rarely return and reread. But when you're a professor, you reread all the time. And I find that to be really useful. And it reminds you of the way that how contingent the sort of pleasure in reading is, that you like, sometimes I'll read a story that I love and it'll just like shake me to my bones. And 2 years later, I'll read it and I'll have like sort of no response to it really. And it's very like how sort of, it's interesting to think about like the ways in which stories provoke emotions, like the fever dream thing we were talking about, and yet how contingent that is on the sort of the willingness of the reader to engage, and how can the writer sort of provoke that. And also the students are, it's nice to be around young people who are excited about writing, who, I'll teach stories for 20 years and still be surprised by things people say about them that I had never considered before. And like, there's always something new in the texts, and the students really sort of help you see that sort of endless mindability of the literature, that you can just keep digging down, 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 and there's always more. And so they keep it fresh in a way that I think is really fun and helpful to be reminded of, so they keep you from getting jaded. Gil has gotten jaded in his teaching, but I don't feel that way at all. So.
I do ask because I did a joint course, so I did creative writing and literature, and it was kind of, when I had to be in sort of writing mode, I found it frustrating to try and turn off the like
critical
literature brain and not sort of try and analyze my own writing as I was writing it. So I was just curious to see how that sort of translates down the road.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be able, as a writer, that's a really good point, and you have to like shut off that critical apparatus. When I'm writing, I like, the unconscious part of the mind, which is so much the fuel for creative work, is making these connections that I'm not really aware of, and I'm writing. And then only in revision, and really only when people start to read it and talk to me about it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, that is in there. And I become sort of like aware of things. And that's in some ways the sort of risk of workshop is, in creative writing classes, is it makes you too self-aware. So you have to like find where the balance is, and like be willing to shut out not just other people's voices when you're working on your own work, but your own voice.
Yeah.
And just let the dream take over. It's not always possible. And sometimes the critical mind gets in the way. It's like, I want the story to be about X. And then that sort of, at least for me, will often sort of kill the story, because I'll try to force it to be this thing that I just can't really make it be. And I think letting it be more like a dream, more like play, is like really important and difficult. So I try to encourage that in my students. Like, we do a lot of writing in class, and then talk about it, just to like, because it's like a studio art. Like if you were a drawing class, you talk about technique and perspective, and then you would draw. And so I try to build that into my creative writing classes. Like, this is an art class, like as if you were doing violin or painting, but
very cool.
Language. So.
Okay, last two questions. So we've already talked about unreliable narrators, but you have mentioned about Gil and sort of Matthew, and who's the real antagonist in the story. And I do think this is something that sort of gets questioned along the way. because even in my sort of like second reading, when I did it in Romanian, I was still like, I kind of like know what to anticipate now, but they're still both being very shady. um, and I do like you have just said that you don't sort of like impose anything on the story. But did you sort of try and like do this from the beginning, or did you just sort of appear as very I kind of see them in a weird way as like two sides of sort of the same coin, especially because sort of Matthew reflects sort of Gil's insecurities. So this whole who's the real bad guy in the story kind of fit really well within the dynamic. And it does kind of feel like a good versus evil kind of situation, but also not.
Yeah, that's a great. I mean, that's something I thought about the whole time. I think when I
Okay.
talked about like the drafting process,
Mm-hmm.
when I first wrote it, I felt like I had to be on Gil's side, uh,
Mm-hmm.
or like Team Gil. That it was like Gil was right, right.
Mm-hmm.
But then I finished the book, and he was too right. There wasn't enough of the ambiguity. There wasn't enough of the tension, suspense. The suspense sort of uh, became frustration because it's like Gil is correct, and why can't people just accept that? It's almost like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so then it was sort of complicating that all the time. So originally, Matthew writes is in Gil's creative writing class, as I mentioned, and he writes sort of what are to Gil, and I think reasonably to anyone would be sort of disturbing creative writing submissions
Mm-hmm.
to his,
Mm-hmm.
that he puts in forward for class. But and the last one is about the death of his mother, and that really troubles Gil. And that story had been woven through much earlier in the book,
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
much longer, and it just sort of simplified the story too much. So it was always just trying to make it more and more complicated. So when it started, it was like all Gil, and then
Mm-hmm.
the revision process was that making it that two-sided coin, as you
Mm-hmm.
say, like
Mm-hmm.
constantly troubling the idea that Gil was correct without um, uh, like tipping too far against Gil, because
Mm-hmm.
Gil is completely obviously insane. Then that sort of takes a lot of suspense, I think, in some ways
Mm-hmm.
out of.
Mm-hmm.
So there still has to be this possibility. In a lot of ways, ultimately, it seems like maybe they're both villains, just different types of villains, and there is
Mm-hmm.
no hero except maybe Molly, the Gil's wife, is maybe the hero, the one who acts like an adult and knows how to be an adult more fully. And so I think that sort of evolution, that Gil is sure that he's the hero of the story, and then constantly sort of like making him more and more troubled as a hero as the story goes on, so that in the end, perhaps he is actually the villain of the story. And that's been fun to talk about with writers. I mean, with readers, like a lot of readers, as you say, like really choose a side. They're like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Gil is terrible, or he is a
Yeah.
bad guy, or other people are like, Gil is absolutely right. Matthew is terrible.
Yeah.
And it's fun for me that there are these two possibilities that the book puts forward. Like it's not clear,
Mm.
and yet I think a lot of people that I've met feel really strongly one way or the other, that they are convinced by Gil or not convinced by Gil.
Mm.
Way that um, is fun to discuss with them, because it has a lot to do with their own perceptions of youth and their own perceptions of like family, and all these things get fed into it, and they'll
Yeah.
uh, in a way that makes us all a little bit like Gil, although hopefully most of us are nowhere near as extreme as Gil in our in our paranoia.
I'm too much of a I can see both sides of the story to sort of take a side. And this is why I like actually asked the question, because it's like, I don't know,
Yeah,
there's no side. I'm just uh
I mean, because the book is written in Gil's sort of point of view for most of the book, um, I sort of had to believe along with him that he was right in the beginning.
yeah.
So I still feel like a part of me is still more pro Gil
Mm, mm,
than Matthew, but and also Gil builds up this sort of story about who Matthew is and the
yeah.
kind of person he is, and he's like finding these clues which are maybe just bits of data that are not actually clues, but he's convinced they're clues, that he builds up into this portrait of Matthew as a certain kind of person. And to have him do that and to write it with him makes me sort of sympathetic toward him, but I still see, totally understand why some people
Yeah.
find him to be the bad guy.
Well, you know how it is. Writing and reading are completely,
Yeah.
different experiences. Um, but if there was something that you sort of wanted readers to be left with once they finish the book, other than the impression that they have just woken up from a fever dream, what would it be? I know this I don't know, psychological thrillers don't tend to necessarily be the kind of stories where you sort of want people to walk away with a final message or, but if there was something that you wanted them to leave with.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that one of the issues that the book raises that I think is present in a lot of people's lives, especially when you get a little older, is sort of your relationship with your family and how
Mm,
that changes and evolves over time. You know, when our families are our whole worlds when we're children, and then you grow up and you make your own families, like families, your chosen family of your friends
mhm,
and your workplace and your career and your partner, if you eventually have a partner, and children and so on. And all of that begins to sort of change and shift and influence your sort of family. And I think a lot of people, because of the centrality of family, have this idea of like a sort of locked idea of like what their childhood was like.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and that actually the novel suggests that all of that is very malleable and constantly evolving as our relationships evolve and change, so that we become more flexible and ideally, unlike Gil, more generous in our sort of regard of those closest to us, right?
mhm,
Because we
mhm,
cherish this idea we had of them, but they've changed too, right? They've gotten decades older and are sort of
mhm,
different people in a lot of ways. And so remaining open and flexible to that, as Gil fails to do with his sister and then later with her son,
mhm,
Matthew, that he's too rigid in his idea of
mhm,
like who his sister is supposed to be versus who she appears to be, and he can't reconcile that, and it creates this conflict between them. Same with Matthew. He assumes he's still this boy he was when he was 11, and they went to Montauk and on the to the beach with him, and that he's still that same boy, and this inability to like sort of adapt
mhm.
as people evolve and change, I think that's his real flaw, Gil's flaw, and something that I think other people in the book, Molly, for example, are much better at navigating that sort of
Mm.
fungibility of character, that it's constantly evolving and changing, and that we have to accept that even about the people who we think of as at like the center of our lives, right? Like our own our siblings, our parents, our own children, right, are constantly evolving and changing, and yet we have this idea of who they are that is so central to our sense of ourself and our happiness. So that sort of openness, I think, is something Gil really lacks and could be a sort of
So
a
basically,
warning.
yeah, we should not be like Gil. Okay, do the opposite of what Gil does.
Right? Whatever he does, you're doing this, you're like, Gil would do this, don't do it.
The other way, yeah, yeah. Awesome. Thank you so
Yeah,
much
thank you.
for taking the time to answer all my questions. And I personally cannot wait for more people, at least in Romania, to discover the book.